Hello folks, and welcome to the 7th part of the in-depth analysis of The Last of Us. In this episode, we'll be wrapping up our character analysis, and we'll be doing so by taking a look at two characters who have become synonymous with gaming excellency, Joel and Ellie. These two may be the most complex characters we've seen in modern AAA gaming, which is why I figured they needed their own episode. So let's not beat around the bush anymore, let's get right into it by talking about the game's main playable character, Joel. So, what do we know about Joel? Let's start with some basics. According to the newspaper we find at the beginning of the game, we can conclude that Joel was born on September 26th. We can't be quite certain of what year he was born in, but most guesswork seems to bring us to 1984 or 85. While he hasn't been given an official last name yet, the Japanese manual to the game states that Joel's last name is in fact Miller. Please note though that this has not been confirmed in-game or by Naughty Dog, so take that with a grain of salt. Another thing that's never stated outright is what profession he had before the outbreak. However, given the conversation he has with Tommy at the beginning of the game, an educated guess would be that he was probably a carpenter. His main hobby seems to be playing music, something he more or less confirms when he talks to Ellie at the campus. Other than that, we really don't know that much about him, or for that matter, why he's no longer together with Sarah's mother. Apparently they were married at some point, but other than that, we really have no idea what happened to her. Speaking of Sarah, it's been deducted that she was either born in the year 2000 or 2001. If the calculation about Joel's age is correct, this would mean that he had Sarah when he was 15 or 16. In other words, he was very young when he became a father. This is also what prevented him from ever going to college, something we can assume he would have liked to do. And that's basically all the backstory we can extract about Joel. With that stated, let's talk about Joel's actions leading up to Sarah's death. Something that becomes obvious very early is that Joel is really quick to go into a full-on survivor mode. He is obviously ready to kill in order to protect those he cares about, as demonstrated when he shoots the neighbor. We also see him command Tommy to ignore other refugees as they're driving away from their house. His one single thought seems to be getting himself, Tommy and Sarah out of there, no matter the cost. We also see that he tries to keep information away from Sarah in order to keep her calm, not too dissimilar to what he does to Ellie later in the game. One thing is unmistakable though, he is extremely protective of those close to him. This is mirrored in his every action leading up to Sarah's death, which just adds to that tragedy. Despite his best efforts, he was unable to save her, regardless of how much he was ready to sacrifice. Not only has he lost his only child, but he did so in a way that he probably feels that he could have prevented. With all of this in mind, it's easy to see why he became the person he did in between the end of the prologue and the beginning of the main game. So, what happened in those nebulous 20 years? Well, something that is very obvious is that he and Tommy started growing apart. I think we can conclude that this was probably a very rough period for both brothers. This is flat out stated by Tommy in the Wyoming chapter, plus backed up by the fact that he decided to eventually leave Joel. We know that Tommy went to the Fireflies, but where Joel went is a little more uncertain. From the information that we have, we can conclude that he was most likely a bandit, at least for a time. This is heavily implied when Ellie asks him how he knew that the bandit who was faking an injury was, in fact, faking. This is actually further supported by the developers time and time again stating that Joel is a man with, quote, very few moral lines left to cross, which indicates that he has done some fairly heinous things in his days. It's also heavily implied that he was very depressed during this time, maybe even to the point where he was contemplating suicide. I think that this is implied when he and Ellie are passing through the hotel and Ellie comes across the couple who seemingly took their own lives.
Guess they took the easy way out, huh?
Well, it ain't easy. For many, it was better than letting a clicker or a hunter do it for them.
Trust me, it ain't easy.
At some point though, he made his way to Boston, became a smuggler and started hanging out with Tess. From what we can tell, it seems that he never really spoke about his past, as there are few if any indications that Tess knows anything about Sarah. Speaking of Tess, it's quite possible that she and Joel had a romantic relationship at some point. However, I've already talked about this in a previous episode, so I won't go further into it here. And this basically brings us to the beginning of the main game. So, how's Joel doing when we catch up with him again? Well, I suppose it would be a bit of a lie to say that he's doing well. He does however seem to find himself in a place that's relatively stable. So while I wouldn't really say that he's doing well, I'd say that this is probably the least miserable he's been in a while. As is visible throughout more or less the whole first chapter of the game, he is not a big fan of change. He is obviously very hesitant to take on Ellie, and he keeps talking to Tess about how they can just go back. I can only interpret this as him being afraid of what change might bring. He's in a place where things are relatively stable, and he does not want to upset that very delicate balance. And yet, here he is, finding himself on a mission that could endanger the life of the one person he cares about, that being Tess, as well as being with a girl who reminds him a bit too much of his late daughter. As such, he seems hesitant to even acknowledge Ellie as a person. It seems to me that he's thinking along the lines of, if I don't let anyone close to me, they won't be near enough to hurt me. I should add though that this hesitance does not mean that he's incapable of forming new friendships. For example, we see him get at least kind of friendly with Bill and Henry. On some level, he also seems to want to nurture and maintain these relationships. For example, he tells Bill that he is sorry about what happened to Frank. I interpret this as him trying to make amends for being unintentionally insensitive about Frank's suicide. Anyhow, back to him being afraid of change. After Tess dies, he seems almost apathetic to the situation. He doesn't want to talk about Tess, he doesn't want to talk about Sarah, and it seems like he would rather not talk to Ellie at all. It seems to me that he is assessing the situation. In the end, he decides to carry out Tess's last will, that Ellie should reach the Fireflies. Whether he's doing it for Tess or just wants something to occupy his mind is hard to say. If there's one moment where his heart starts to soften up towards Ellie, I'd say that's in the truck. Here he has an interaction with Ellie that actually brings him some joy and comfort. He is obviously quite anxious about it, but there's no doubt that he also very much appreciates it. When the two of them arrive in Pittsburgh, Joel's relation to violence comes front and center. He is pretty much remorseless when it comes to killing, no matter how brutally he dispatches his foes. While there are those who say that this makes him a very cruel individual, I would argue that he is a man shaped by the world he is now living in. This is a place where diplomacy has been all but eradicated, and words like moral high ground ring hollow. As I said in a previous video, when dealing with many other survivors, the only thing a pacifist approach is gonna get you is a clean conscience when someone else is stomping your head in. With all of this in mind, it's hard to argue that Joel's tendencies towards violence has not served him well. He's had to learn how to fight, defend himself, and even kill. If he had not learned these skills, he would probably not have lived long enough to meet Ellie. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that his behavior, or the behavior of the hunters for that matter, is justified by this. I still find what both of them do morally reprehensible. What I am saying though is that Joel has adapted to his surroundings. He has learned to deal with the hunters on their own terms, and he's become pretty damn good at it. As such, I would say that his brutality is a tragic necessity in order for him and Ellie to survive. It's also in Pittsburgh where he is forced to start trusting Ellie. At the outset, he does not trust her with a weapon, but eventually it becomes necessary for him to do so in order for them to proceed. It's around this time we also see how Joel handles being scared. When they reunite at the hotel, after Ellie's first kill, Joel basically scolds her, even if he doesn't do so with a lot of words. He calls her stupid and reckless, and doesn't even thank her for saving his life. This is him reacting to fearing for her safety. I think we all know at least one person who does this. When they're afraid, they blame you for putting yourself in that situation and making them worry, even if the situation was completely out of your control. After this though, he awkwardly tries to mend the situation. It's like he really wants to make his point, but at the same time he's kind of uncomfortable with the silence that comes afterwards. Anyhow, they overcome this little bump, and you get the feeling that they grow even closer as they're traveling with Henry and Sam. So what is it then that makes Joel want to get rid of Ellie by the time they get to Tommy and Maria's compound? Honestly, I think he was traumatized by the deaths of Henry and Sam. He was painfully reminded of how fragile human life actually is, and how even the most tightly knit pair can perish within seconds. He has been growing closer and closer to Ellie, and he does not want to risk that happening to them. He also knows that if he doesn't separate from Ellie now, he's never gonna be able to do so. He's starting to care for her, and that scares him. He does not want to risk losing someone who's close to him again, so he tries to leave Ellie in the most capable hands he can find, his own brothers. When he finds her at a ranch, he tries to push her away one last time, with, as I've said before, probably the cruelest line in the whole game.
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad. We are going our separate ways.
I've complained before how it seems that his mind shifts rather quickly on the way back, and I still stand by that. However, I feel like this is more a timing issue than anything. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the change itself. It's just that the scene of them traveling back to the camp is so short that it seems a bit rushed. Still, as I said, the change itself is quite believable. This is basically Joel submitting to the fact that Ellie is important to him now and he is not gonna let her go. After this, there is no going back. She is a part of his life now, and he doesn't put up with her anymore. He wants her around. In other words, he's made himself vulnerable again. Vulnerable to losing someone he deeply cares about. But it's obviously a risk he's willing to take. As they travel through the campus, his starts opening up more and more. And honestly, he seems kind of relieved. It's like he finally has someone he feels he can talk to. It's after this that Ellie becomes more important to him than ever, in that she saves his life. When he wakes up during the winter chapter, you get the feeling that his primal instinct to protect those close to him is more powerful than ever. She's now the most important thing in his life, and he's going to go to any length to protect her. This is also where we see him at probably his most vicious. Now he's no longer just killing people, he's outright torturing them. It shows that even though his feelings might have changed, his methods have not. And, after all, why should they? Violence and ruthlessness got him this far, and honestly, this isn't the time to stop to try to find a more diplomatic and peaceful solution. After the episode with David, the two of them basically become inseparable. They've saved each other's lives more than once, and they now know that the only people they can rely on in the whole world are each other. This is where Joel dares to believe that there may be a bright future ahead for them. If they can just get to the Fireflies and get the vaccine done, maybe he and Ellie can live happily in this new world they helped create. However, as mentioned before, the events of the winter has traumatized Ellie. In a way, their roles have changed, with Ellie being more reserved and Joel being more optimistic and outgoing. Ellie is, however, able to make one last breakthrough with him. She gets him to realize that he can't escape his past by showing him the picture of Sarah. Now he dares to look to the future, a future he hopes he'll have together with Ellie. But then, it's all seemingly taken away from him when it's clear that Ellie has to die in order for the vaccine to be made. He is not willing to go through this again, and he is not willing to let the Fireflies revert him back to the hell that he's been going through over the past 20 years. I've already talked about Joel's reasoning during the ending in a previous episode, so I won't go further into it here. There are some things I would like to add to that, but that will be done in a later video. It's basically gonna be a post-mortem for the whole series, where I look back at the game and reflect on what I've learned about it while making these videos. But I digress. So in closing, what's Joel like as a character? If I was given 2 words to describe him, I would say that he is delightfully complex. Sometimes he is quite frustrating and sometimes he is a bit of an asshole, but regardless of what happens, it's always understandable why he is acting the way he does. I believe that he is genuinely a good person. However, all the things that has happened to him, as well as the world around him, doesn't allow him to be that person. As such, I believe that he is almost the perfect vehicle for this story. He is not unfazed by all the death and torment around him, however, he's grown so used to it. This aspect would have been really hard to pull off with a less hardened character, and that's why I think Joel works so well as a protagonist. This is also why he is such a perfect companion to Ellie. He has already gone through the journey that she is currently on. He starts at a point where many other characters end their character development. And I think that's one of the most interesting narrative aspects of the game. What happens to the hardened survivor after the credits roll? We get to see him rediscover his humanity and love in his own very twisted way. He can never go back to the way he was, however he is given so much hope that he starts to believe that maybe it's possible for him to start trying. The end of Joel's character arc is not that he is cured or restored or anything like that, but rather it's him taking one great step, and that is that he allows himself to be dependent on other people. He allows himself to be dependent on Ellie for comfort and on Tommy for safety. In closing, Joel is probably the most interesting character we saw this last console generation, and definitely within the genre. I dare say that the things he did, said and experienced are gonna be with us for a long, long time. Let's move on now to the other character that really make The Last of Us into what it is, Ellie. If Joel was one of the best male characters this console generation, then Ellie was a goddamn groundbreaker when it comes to females. As far as I can remember, she is the only non-sexualized lead female character in a AAA console exclusive. In fact, the last time I can remember Sony trying for a female lead in one of their exclusives was in Heavenly Sword, and yeah, that didn't really work. We'll get into why Ellie is such a wonderful character in just a little bit. First, I want to give a few heads ups about what I'm not going to be talking about when talking about Ellie. First of all, I will not be talking about the majority of the content in the comic book American Dreams. Primarily, this is because I haven't read it yet, but I started looking through a plot summary on the wiki, and honestly, I didn't find it particularly interesting. I won't leave it out completely, I will still bring up some of the stuff that has some influence on the game, like Ellie meeting Marlene for the first time. Other than that though, the comic will be left out, as I don't really feel it contributes a whole lot to the conversation. Another thing I will not be bringing up here is the events of the DLC Left Behind. Now before you freak out on me, don't worry, I will be covering Left Behind eventually. As a matter of fact, it will be getting its own video. I could have brought it up here, but I don't feel it would do the story justice if I try to squeeze it in an overall discussion. But trust me, I have a lot of things to say about Left Behind. And as such, I want to cover it in great detail. So that will most likely be episode number 9 of this series. For now though, I will primarily be discussing Ellie and her character development in the main game. Given her age in the game, we can conclude that Ellie was born in 2018 or 19. Like Joel, she doesn't have an official last name, however, according to the Japanese manual, once again, it suggested that her last name is Williams. Oddly enough, there's actually some proof to suggest that this might be correct. In the Left Behind DLC, there is a scene where Ellie tries to log into Facebook. When she enters her last name, the characters are hidden, however we can see that it is 8 characters, the same amount as in Williams. Now, granted, there are several other last names with 8 characters, however this certainly puts Williams within the realm of possibility. Anyhow, because Ellie was born after the outbreak, she grew up in a very isolated environment. There is no indication that she ever knew any of her parents, and while we don't know a damn thing about her father, we do know a few things about her mother. Her name was Anna, and she was obviously a very close friend to Marlene. Since she asked Marlene to look after Ellie, it's only logical to assume that Ellie's father was either dead or at the very least missing at the time of her birth. We can also speculate on whether Anna was a Firefly or not. However, the big problem with those speculations is that we don't have a date on when the Fireflies were formed. As such, we can't even say if they existed by the time Ellie was born. Regardless though, Anna and Marlene were obviously very close, as indicated by Marlene's audio logs found in the hospital. 13 years later, some time after Ellie has arrived in the Boston quarantine zone, she comes into contact with Marlene again. Marlene then hands her a letter written to Ellie by Anna. This letter can actually be found in Ellie's backpack during the winter chapter. For those of you who haven't read it, it reads as follows. Ellie, I'm going to share a secret with you. I am not a big fan of kids and I hate babies. And yet, I'm staring at you and I'm just awestruck. You're not even a day old, and holding you is the most incredible thing I've done in my life, a life that is about to get cut a little short. Marlene will look after you. There is no one in this world I trust more than her. When the time comes, she'll tell you about me. Don't give her too much of a hard time. Try not to be as stubborn as me. I'm not going to lie, this is a pretty messed up world. It won't be easy. The thing you always have to remember is that life is worth living. Find your purpose and fight for it. I see so much strength in you. I know you'll turn out to be the woman you're meant to be. Forever, your loving mother, Anna. Make me proud, Ellie. If you read this letter, Ellie will quietly say,
I'm trying to make you proud.
It turns out that Ellie's switchblade also originally belonged to Anna. Following all of this, Ellie obviously looks up a lot to Marlene. It pretty quickly becomes obvious that she is looking for a mother or father figure in her life, and for the time being, Marlene serves that purpose. 3 weeks before the main game starts, Left Behind takes place and Ellie gets bitten. When she doesn't turn, Marlene realizes that she's probably immune and that she needs to be turned over to their medical specialists. And so, she starts looking for smugglers to get Ellie out of the city. Initially, she's very skeptical towards Joel and Tess, and understandably so. For starters, they are 2 new people who she doesn't even know if she can trust or not, and secondly, this takes her away from Marlene and out of her relative comfort zone. I will say though that it seems like she's warming up to Tess just a little bit more. It could be that Tess is a bit more sympathetic towards her, but it could also be that she's more comfortable around grown women at this point. That is of course pure speculation. As they begin their journey, it becomes apparent that Ellie is a bit naive to how the world works. For example, when they're caught by the patrol, she says that she thought that they were just gonna hold them up or something, as opposed to killing them. Simply put, I'd say that she's just not used to this kind of confrontation. Upon revealing her immunity, I get the feeling that she's not quite convinced herself that it might actually be of any help. She seems to give off the vibe that this is Marlene's plan and Marlene's idea, and she's just going along with it. She might be a bit more convinced after she hears Tess talk to Joel about how this may be the real deal. Regardless, it seems to me like she's becoming more and more aware of her role as the game goes on. When Tess dies, she's obviously taken aback and guilt-stricken. It seems like even here she's feeling guilty about it, saying things like, I didn't mean for this to happen. She's clearly shaken, and at the same time, she's also frustrated with Joel, who refuses to talk about it. Here we can see that the 2 characters deal with grief in the polar opposite of ways. Joel distances himself from it emotionally, he doesn't want to talk about it, and hopes that one day, through ignoring it, he will forget. Ellie, meanwhile, wants to talk about it and tries to get her feelings out there right here, right now. This is something we'll obviously be coming back to. As they make their way through Bill's town, Ellie becomes more and more keen to prove herself to Joel. At this point, he's hesitant to trust her with, well, anything, but he becomes forced to do so when they try to start the car. And, as we all know, she manages to pull it off. I'd say that this is her first major breakthrough in earning Joel's trust and respect. As they proceed, she seems to become more and more accustomed to the violence, especially towards other non-infected humans. This culminates in her first kill. After this, she's obviously shaken again and in dire need of support, something that Joel is unable to give her then and there. As I mentioned earlier, this is not due to him being a douche, but rather due to him being upset. In some bizarre way, Ellie gets the support she desires when she's handed the rifle. Here she's not only trusted with a weapon for the first time, but Joel also says that he's relying on her. I think that she feels that this is his way of saying thank you for shooting his attacker earlier. The look she gives him seems to signify that she feels that they're on the same team again. When she pulls through, it's apparent that she's earned more of Joel's trust. From here on in, she's gonna continue learning by doing, as she's put in several more perilous situations. Whilst traveling with Henry and Sam, we see Ellie do something that we come to realize that she hasn't had a lot of time to do in her life: being a kid. Her and Sam play darts, they play football, and in general just fool around a bit. And when you think about it, when would she have had the time to do something like this otherwise? It kinda makes me wonder if the world in its current state has in some way robbed her of the opportunity to act her age. She's been forced to act like an adult survivor basically since day one, and I'm curious to see how this will affect her when she grows up. In the conversation between her and Sam the night before he turns, we get to find out what her greatest fear is: being left alone. She almost seems a little desensitized to the world around her and the immediate danger posed by the infected and the hunters. It's like she's gotten so used to them that she's not really afraid of them anymore, at least not in that capacity. Her fear seems to be more of a social nature. It could also be the fact that she's gotten used to being immune. The only thing she has to fear from the infected is a violent death, which means that a major element that makes other people afraid of them has been removed for her. It could also be that she went through this fear when she was bitten, which would mean that she's more or less past it, at the lack of a better term. Her fear of being left alone probably stems from Riley dying, and she doesn't want to go through that emotional hell one more time. Moving on to the fall chapter, here we see that Ellie is a bit more sentimental than Joel is. When they come across a grave, she remembers that she forgot to put Sam's toy robot on his. She's still thinking about what happened to him and Henry. She wants to talk about it. She wants to find some way to process her sorrow. Again, the polar opposite of Joel. After the shootout in the dam, she has what could probably be described as her most rebellious moment. I get the feeling that her running away isn't so much to get away, but rather as a tool to try to scare Joel. I have to say though that even though her reaction could be considered a little childish, it's completely understandable. She feels betrayed, like he's been putting up an act this whole time and he never really cared about it. She's hoping to appeal to him by opening up and showing herself as vulnerable, telling him what he actually means to her. She wants him to know how desperately afraid she is of being left alone. While this appeal obviously works in the end, I can't help but wonder how she would get along with Tommy. Tommy's a lot more sympathetic in nature than Joel, so honestly, I think the two of them would have made a pretty good team. On that though, we can only speculate. At the university, she is really put to the test, as not only her own life, but also Joel's, rest in her hands. She keeps them alive using more or less every trick she's learned, but she still doesn't seem entirely confident in her actions. When Joel falls off the horse, she asks him what to do, signifying that she's not only very afraid, but also a bit insecure in her abilities. Nevertheless though, she is able to make the right calls yet again, leading us into the winter chapter. When first encountering David and James, Ellie shows that she has learned quite a bit about handling strangers. She is cautious, but she still manages to get quite a bit of information out of them. She is, however, still a little naive. She's still initially taken in a bit by David, even though he has already proven that he can't be trusted. And by that I mean that he was hiding another gun after she asked him to disarm himself. Regardless though, she can still hold her own and she makes it back to Joel to give him the medicine. Capable as she might be though, she is still a bit in over her head. She does get captured, but I wouldn't say that this is the result of overconfidence, rather her having the odds stacked heavily against her. And in the end, she led them away from Joel, which ended up saving his life yet again. When dealing with David, Ellie shows that she is very headstrong and uncompromising. She's clearly not gonna bother with him, and you can almost even call her a little reckless. She gambles everything on being able to fetch his keys, however, that obviously didn't go too well. Something that struck me as I was writing for this video is that if she had known about Joel's state, then she could probably have played the long game. What I mean by that is that she could have played along and waited for a more opportune moment to strike. I get the feeling though that she wants to get back to Joel and that she's going to do everything in her power to get there as soon as possible. Also, we can't discount the possibility that she might be very afraid and just wants to get out of there. Her encounter with David is her first real contact with the kind of evil that only humans are capable of. Granted, she's been in contact with hunters and whatnot, but this is on a more personal level. When she encounters him in the restaurant, she is no doubt terrified. However, she manages to compose herself enough to be able to face him. Her fear is shown when she's finally able to overpower him. She just wants him dead and gone. She has to keep slashing away at him to make sure that he can never come back. I don't think I've ever seen so much fear, trauma, and rage go into a video game killing. When she is reunited with Joel, she feels a safety that she's probably never felt before. She has no safe place to return to, and without him she wouldn't know where to go. At this point, he is her only safety in the entire world. Regardless though, the events of the winter has clearly left its mark on her. At this point, I reckon that the situation is just simply becoming too much for someone so young to handle. There's the death of Riley, her encounter with David, the world situation as a whole, as well as all the people that she has lost along the way. I think it's safe to say that it's starting to get to her. Still, she bursts back into life when she encounters the giraffes. To her, I think this shows that there are still good things in the world. Some parts of life are still flourishing, and in some weird way, there is a future ahead, with or without the humans. It's around this time that Ellie says that all the things they've been through can't be for nothing. I would actually almost call this a spiritual crisis. She feels like everything she's been through and all the suffering she has experienced has to amount to something in the end. Otherwise, what is there? Has she really gone through all of that to have nothing to show for it? I think that thought scares her, and that makes her even more determined to press on. This is also around the time she gives Joel the photo of Sarah. She says that Maria showed it to her and that she stole it, and if you think about it, there is actually a trend to this. Back at Bill's, she also stole a bunch of stuff, and she seems to have a knack for picking up things along the way. This could actually be signs of kleptomania, but I digress. While there isn't much to say about Ellie during the hospital sequence, as she was obviously knocked out for the majority of it, I think there is one relevant question we have to ask. If she had known the stakes and the consequences, would she have gone through with the surgery? I'm gonna go with probably. My main argument for this is her previous statement, in that it can't be for nothing. I honestly don't think her will to survive at this point is that strong, and if her death meant that she could help countless others, then I think she would have done it. You can add to that her loyalty to Marlene, and by extension, her mother. And even though Joel would have protested, it's possible that she would see it as her chance to give him a world to live in. Also, let's not forget, she's in a vulnerable state of mind. Her encounter with David is still fresh in her memory, and as I said earlier, I think the entire situation is starting to break her. Add to that her survivor's guilt towards Tess, Sam, and Riley. I think she would feel that if she did this, then they would not have died in vain. So yeah, given the choice, I think she would have gone through with the surgery. I also believe that she knows that something is off with the story that Joel is telling her about what happened at the hospital. This leads up to her now iconic demand for the truth. I've already given my thoughts on how she reacts to Joel's answer, so I won't get further into it here. So in conclusion, what can be said about Ellie as a character? Well, as I said earlier, she is the best non-sexualized female character to date, bar none. Hell, the story hardly even calls attention to the fact that she's a girl at all. The few times it is done, it's done in a completely natural way. What they managed to do here is something that many other pieces of media struggle with, writing a female character whose main trait is not that she's female. This may seem obvious, but you'd be surprised how few characters there are that are written in the same vein as Ellie. I would also say she's one of the best written teenage characters I've seen in a while. She doesn't come off as an adult trapped in a child's body or vice versa. It's a tricky balancing act, but I would say that they pull it off damn near flawlessly. It's also great to see that they managed to break several tropes in how they used her and Joel's character. On that note, I've heard people complain that she's a damsel in distress, that she only exists for Joel to save her. My response to that is quite simple. Bull fucking shit! She exists only to be saved as much as Joel does. They more or less take turns in saving each other's lives, and it's obvious to anybody who's actually played the game that if they didn't have each other, they would be dead many times over. Now don't get me wrong, I am all for breaking new ground in this territory, and I would argue that there are still one too many games who rely on various damsel tropes. That said though, this really isn't one of them. It is possible for male and female characters to save each other without gender politics being involved. And hell, if anybody would still argue that Ellie is a damsel, the whole winter chapter is her getting herself out of trouble before Joel can even get to her. So I would say save your criticisms for those who actually deserve it, and to quote Todd in the Shadows, fight the real enemy. Anyhow, back to Ellie. I think one of the most interesting aspects of her character is that she goes through the journey that Joel went through before the game even started. As the game progresses, she starts to lose both hope and conviction, and she ends up basically where Joel was when he opened the door for Tess at the beginning of the game. By the time she gets there though, Joel has moved on to a slightly more positive attitude. I would say we as players can draw fairly solid conclusions about where Joel is going emotionally, however as to where Ellie is going, that is completely uncertain. Another great function that Ellie has is that she sets up an interesting knowledge triangle between her, Joel, and the player. Let me explain. Ellie knows very little about the world as it is, and even less about the way it was. We as players know a lot about how it was, i.e. the age we are currently living in, but less about how it's become within the game universe. Joel, on the other hand, knows a lot about how it is and how it was. As such, any conversations they have about the world, in either its past or present state, functions according to this fairly interesting dynamic. I think that this turns Ellie into a fairly interesting knowledge link, giving Joel an excuse to tell us things we know and things we don't know. It also makes us wonder what it would be like to grow up on this planet without knowing what it once was. I don't know, I just think it's an interesting thought experiment. Finally, there is also the topic of Ellie's sexuality. As you might have expected, I will be talking about this further when I talk about Left Behind. All I'll say for now is brilliantly handled. Overall though, I think it's safe to say that this game would not have worked without Ellie. She is the textbook example of what a writer should keep in mind when writing a character her age. I know that this might sound a bit grandiose, but I would go as far as to say that she is one of the most important characters ever to have been put in a video game. And that is gonna do it for part 7. Thank you ever so much for watching, and to those of you who've been waiting for this since October, like I say, thank you for your patience. I feel reasonably comfortable in saying that you will not have to wait for more than 6 months for part 8. Seriously though, it will come out relatively soon. However, it will not be around 30 minutes because holy crap, this one was a lot of work. Part 8 is gonna be about the music in the game, and I'm gonna be changing up the format just a little bit to match that. Hopefully you folks will like it. If you're curious about what I'm doing and how the next video is coming along, then you can always follow me on Facebook and Twitter. The links are in the description. Again, thanks for watching and thanks for waiting. I well and truly appreciate it. Take care, and I hope to catch you later.